Let go of me.
You'll fall.
Then tell me whose arms I'm in.
Elowen.
I never told you my name. How do you know me?
I don't.
Then why say my name like a prayer?
Because Ashveil buried it 6 years ago.
Elowen.
The cane struck a stone half a second before her shoulders struck a wall of muscle and velvet. Elowen gasped, and the world tilted the way it always did when her balance failed her before her hands could catch up. A strong arm closed around her waist before she hit the ground. She felt the heat of him first, then the scent, cedar and rain and something colder beneath it, like frost on iron. And then his hand found hers, steadying it against his chest, and the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. "Careful," he said, low, controlled. The voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. She could not see him. She had not seen anything in 6 years, not since the fever took the color from her world and left her only shapes of light and dark, warmth and cold, sound and silence. But she felt him go still, utterly still, as if her hand in his had stopped time itself. "I'm sorry," she breathed, already pulling back, already reaching for the cane that had clattered somewhere near his boots. "I didn't hear anyone. Elowen." The name left him like a confession, like something he hadn't meant to say aloud in 6 years. She froze, because she had not told him her name. Somewhere behind them, a servant's tray hit the floor. Somewhere above them, in the gallery that overlooked the west corridor of Ashveil Palace, a conversation between two ladies-in-waiting died mid-sentence. And somewhere in the marrow of the ancient stone building, it seemed as though the palace itself had frozen around the sound of that single whispered word. Elowen stood very still, her unseeing eyes fixed somewhere near his collarbone, her heart slamming against her ribs like a bird thrown suddenly against glass. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. He did not answer. When she reached out, carefully, the way she reached for everything now, testing the air before trusting it, her fingers grazed a jaw carved from something colder than stone, and then nothing. He had stepped back. The warmth was gone. Only the cold hallway air remained, and the distant, murmuring panic of a palace that had just witnessed the Duke of Ashveil, a man who had not spoken a woman's name aloud in 6 years, a man the court called the Ruthless Duke because rumor said his heart had died with someone he refused to name. Say hers as though he had been waiting to say it his whole life. "Your Grace?" A steward's voice tentative from somewhere down the hall. "See that Lady Cael is escorted safely," the Duke said, and his voice had rebuilt its wall so quickly that Elowen almost doubted what she'd heard. Almost. "She is unharmed." "I am not harmed," Elowen said, lifting her chin, some old defiance rising in her despite the tremor in her hands. "But I would like an answer." Silence. Then footsteps, retreating, unhurried, deliberately unhurried, the footsteps of a man forcing himself not to run. "Another time, Lady Cael," he said, from farther away than she expected. "The palace remembers what it should not." And then he was gone, and Elowen stood alone in the corridor with her cane trembling in her hand and a name, her name, echoing in a voice she had never in her life heard before that morning. She had not wanted to come to Ashveil. 3 weeks earlier, in the modest grey stone house at the edge of Fenmore, her Aunt Bettina had read the letter aloud twice, as if repetition might change its contents. "The Dowager Duchess requests the presence of Miss Elowen Cael at Ashveil Palace, in recognition of services rendered by her late father to the crown, for a season of residence as companion to Lady Serelda Ashford." "I don't know any Dowager Duchess," Elowen had said, turning her teacup slowly between her palms, the porcelain cool and familiar in a world gone abstract. "And I certainly have no services to render a palace. I can't see the color of a rose, Aunt Bettina, let alone read court correspondence." "You read music," her aunt had said gently. "You read people better than most who have their eyes, and your father—" She'd stopped there, the way she always stopped when Elowen's father entered a conversation, as though his name were a door that opened onto rooms neither of them wished to enter. "My father is 11 years dead," Elowen had said. "Whatever service he rendered, it can hardly be repaid now." But the carriage had come anyway 3 days later, black lacquer and silver, and Elowen, 23 years old, unmarried, blind, and increasingly aware that a woman in her position did not refuse an invitation from a duchess, had gone. She had told herself it was curiosity. She had told herself many things. She had not told herself that within a week of arriving at Ashveil, she would collide, quite literally, with a duke twice her rank and reputation, and that he would say her name like a man remembering how to breathe. Duke Desmond Ashcombe did not remember walking to his study. He remembered the door closing behind him. He remembered his own hand shaking as he set it against the oak, as if he could hold the corridor's silence in place by force. And then he remembered nothing until his valet Dermot found him standing at the window with a glass of untouched brandy going warm in his fist. "Your Grace," Dermot's voice was careful. Dermot's voice was always careful, these days, the way one speaks around a man who has buried something he refuses to name. "The staff are talking. Let them talk. They say you spoke a name in the West Corridor. They say you have not spoken that name since. I am aware of what I have not done in 6 years, Dermot." Desmond did not turn from the window. Below him, the palace gardens spread in their disciplined rows, hedges clipped into obedience, roses forced into rows they had never asked to grow in. He had once found the gardens beautiful. Now he only ever noticed how contained they were, how controlled, like everything else he had built around himself since the fire. "She's the new companion," Dermot said. "Lady Cyrilda Ashford's companion, Miss Elowen Cael. Blind since a childhood fever, I'm told. Father was a naval captain, died at sea when she was 12. I know who her father was." Dermot went quiet at that, because in 6 years Dermot had rarely heard his master claim to know anything about anyone with such certainty, such immediate and terrible weight. "Your Grace." Dermot set down the ledger he'd been carrying. "Forgive me, but if there is something the household should understand, there is nothing," Desmond said, and his voice had gone flat, final, the voice that had earned him his name in every court from here to the capital. Ruthless, cold, a man who had sent 2 rival lords from his lands in disgrace, who had broken a merchant guild's back over a trade dispute without so much as raising his voice, who had not smiled, truly smiled, Dermot thought, not the thin diplomatic curve he wore at court functions. Since the winter his betrothed had died in the East Wing fire. Elowen, that had been her name too. Not the same woman. Impossible. The first Elowen Farrow, daughter of a baron, the girl he had loved since they were children racing horses through the Ashveil orchards. The girl he had been 3 weeks from marrying was dead. He had stood over what remained of her rooms himself. He had carried out the small, sad collection of things the fire had not claimed. A hair comb, a single glove, a portrait miniature with the edges scorched black. He kept that miniature in a drawer he had not opened in 4 years. And now, a blind woman with the same name had walked into his corridor and into his arms, and his mouth had said her name before his mind had caught up to the impossibility of it, and he did not know, could not explain, would not have believed it from any other man's lips. Why some ancient, foolish part of him had felt, in that half-second of contact, as though something long buried had just opened its eyes. "Send word to Lady Cyrilda," he said finally, "that her companion is not to be troubled by the incident in the corridor. And Dermot, your Grace, find out everything you can about Miss Cael, quietly." Dermot hesitated, some question forming behind his eyes that he was wise enough not to ask aloud. "As you wish, your Grace." Lady Cyrilda Ashford was, Elowen decided within an hour of meeting her, the sort of woman who filled a room the way perfume filled a closed carriage, inescapably, and not always pleasantly. "You must tell me everything," Cyrilda said, drawing Elowen down onto a chair by the window with an eager grip on her wrist. "The whole palace is speaking of nothing else. The Duke of Ashveil hasn't said a lady's Christian name aloud since before I arrived at court, and I've been here 2 years, and you say he simply said it, out of nowhere." "He didn't explain himself," Elowen said carefully. She had learned, in a world where she could not read a face, to be very careful with what she offered a stranger, and Cyrilda, for all her warmth, was very much still a stranger. And then he left. "How romantic," Cyrilda breathed. It didn't feel romantic. It felt... Elowen paused, searching for the word. Frightening did not seem strong enough, nor was it strange. It felt like he knew something about me that I don't know myself. Cyrilda's grip on her wrist tightened, just slightly. "You should be careful of that man, Elowen. May I call you Elowen? Everyone here is dreadfully formal and it exhausts me." She didn't wait for permission. "He's not cruel." "Precisely. I've never seen him raise a hand or a voice to anyone beneath him. But there's a coldness in him that frightens people more than cruelty would. My cousin says he watches a room the way a man watches a battlefield he's already decided to burn." "Then why?" Elowen asked slowly. Would a man like that whisper my name like it was the only warm thing he'd said in years? Cyrilda had no answer for that. For once, the talkative young noblewoman fell entirely silent, and in that silence, Elowen heard something she recognized instantly, because she had spent 6 years learning to hear what people's voices did when their faces gave nothing away. Cyrilda was afraid, not of the Duke, of the answer to Elowen's question. Elowen did not see the Duke again for 4 days, though she felt his absence the way one feels a held breath, waiting to know when it would break. On the second of those days, a young footman named Rennick, nervous, kind, prone to describing things in more detail than she asked for, which she had quickly come to appreciate rather than resent, guided her through the palace's east-facing gallery, where portraits of generations of Ashcombe dukes hung in gilded silence. "There's a gap here, my lady," Rennick said, pausing her hand against the wall between 2 frames. "Where a portrait used to hang, nobody talks about why it's gone." "Whose portrait?" Rennick's voice dropped, the particular hush of a servant, repeating something he'd been told not to repeat. "Lady Elowen Cael's, my lady, His Grace's betrothed. They say he took it down himself, the week after the funeral, and no one's ever found where he put it." Elowen said nothing, but she filed the detail away carefully, the way she filed every detail in this palace now, as a piece of some larger shape she could not yet see but could feel pressing against her from every direction, patient and enormous. "There's something else," Rennick added, quieter still. "The investigation into the fire, my uncle was one of the guardsmen called that night. He always said the smoke smelled wrong. Lamp oil doesn't burn like that, he said. Not enough to take a whole wing before anyone could raise the alarm." He hesitated. He was let go from service 3 months later. No explanation given. "Rennick." Elowen turned toward him, her unseeing eyes fixed somewhere near his face out of old habit. "Why are you telling me this?" A long pause. "Because you asked the Duke about the fire in the music room, my lady. The walls in this palace are thinner than the stone would have you believe, and because," his voice wavered, "my uncle's never stopped believing someone silenced him on purpose. I think he'd be glad to know someone was finally asking again." She thanked him, and continued down the gallery alone after he left her at the stair, one hand trailing the cool plaster wall, her mind turning over lamp oil and locked doors and a portrait no one could find, until the details arranged themselves into something that felt less like coincidence and more like architecture, deliberate, built, waiting for someone to notice the load-bearing walls. She filled the rest of the days as she had learned to fill all her days since the fever. With music, with the careful architecture of memorized rooms, with the small triumphs of independence that sighted people never had to earn. She found the palace's chapel by the particular echo of its stone and the cold mineral scent of old candle wax. She found the music room by the smell of beeswax polish and aged wood, and there she discovered a pianoforte that had clearly not been played in years, its keys slightly stiff, as though grief itself had settled into the ivory. She was playing it on the 4th evening, something slow, something her mother had taught her before the fever took her mother too, 3 years after it took her sight, when she became aware, with the particular certainty of a blind woman's instincts, that she was no longer alone. She did not stop playing. "You found the one room in this palace I still visit," a voice said, from the doorway. His voice, low, controlled, and, she noted, with some private and unwilling satisfaction, not entirely steady. "I didn't know it was yours," she said, fingers still moving over the keys, though her whole body had gone alert as a drawn bow. "I'm told it belonged to someone else." A long pause. "It belonged to my mother, and after her, to someone I intended to marry." Elowen's hands are still on the keys. "Intended. She died," he said simply, brutally, the way a man speaks of a wound he has stopped trying to soften. 6 years ago, a fire in the East Wing. Her name was Elowen, she finished, when he did not. "Elowen Cael," he said it like an offering and a wound at once. "You understand now why the corridor—" "I understand why you were startled," she said. "I don't understand why you whispered my name as though you already knew it. I never gave it to you, Your Grace, not before you said it." The silence stretched long enough that she thought perhaps he had left, the way he had left the corridor, retreating from a question he did not wish to answer. But then she heard him cross the room, slowly, deliberately, the sound of a man who did not usually allow himself to be observed hesitating, and felt the air shift as he stopped beside the piano. "Dermot informed me of your name an hour before we met in the corridor," he said finally. "I had already been told who the new companion was. I simply—" He exhaled, and it was the most human sound she had heard from him yet. "I did not expect the coincidence to undo me the way it did. Forgive me. It was not fair to you, to say it as I did, like an accusation, like you owed me an explanation for sharing a dead woman's name." It was, Elowen thought, both an entirely reasonable explanation and not the whole truth. She had spent 6 years learning to hear the shape of a lie in a voice, the way it thinned, the way it rushed to fill silence it should have let sit, and Duke Desmond Ashcombe's voice, for all its careful control, had done neither of those things. But it had done something else. It had softened, very slightly, on the word undo, as if the admission cost him something he had not intended to pay. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, "for your loss." 6 years is a long time to carry a name like a wound, he said. I had thought to myself, recovered, or at least resigned. A pause. And then a woman with her name walked into my arms, and I understood I had only ever been waiting. Elowen's throat tightened, unexpectedly, dangerously. She was not a fool. She recognized the shape of what was happening in this room. A grieving man, a coincidence, a lonely woman a very long way from home, and she knew better than to mistake grief's echo for genuine feeling. And yet, "You should know," she said, striving for lightness she did not entirely feel, "that I am not her. Whatever ghost you're seeing in me, Your Grace, I promise you I am considerably less tragic and considerably more likely to bump into furniture." A sound left him then that she had not expected, short, surprised, almost a laugh, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough that she hadn't caught the warmth beneath it. "No," he agreed. "You are not her." A pause, thoughtful now, careful. "You are something else entirely. I would like to know what." 2 days after their conversation in the music room, Elowen learned what it meant to be watched over by a man the entire court feared. She had gone, that afternoon, to the palace's small conservatory at Cyrilda's insistence. "The orchids will do wonders for your spirits, even if you can't see them. The scent alone is worth the walk," and had been standing among the humid warmth and green, growing silence when a man's voice, unfamiliar and overly familiar in the same breath, addressed her from close enough that she startled. "Miss Cael, I've heard a great deal about you. Have you?" she said, stepping back a half-pace. Cain angled instinctively between them. "Lord Fenric Rael," he said, as though the name should mean something to her, as though its weight alone ought to excuse the way he'd closed the distance she'd just opened. "I confess I didn't believe the rumors, that the Ashveil Duke had lost his head over a companion with no dowry to speak of, but I understand the appeal now." His voice dropped, silken, presumptuous. "There's something rather striking about a woman who can't see how a man looks at her. Makes her considerably easier to look at. I can hear a great deal, my lord, whatever I cannot see, and I hear a man who ought to step back before I mistake his nearness for an accident." He laughed, low, unbothered, and reached. She felt the air shift, felt his fingers close loosely around her wrist, before another voice cut through the conservatory's warm silence like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Rael." One word. That was all it took. Fenric's grip vanished instantly. "Your Grace, you were only leaving," Desmond said, and though his voice had not risen, Elowen felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees regardless. "Miss Cael is under my household's protection. I would think carefully, my lord, before you test what that protection means in practice." Fenric's footsteps retreated with considerably less confidence than they'd arrived, and for a long moment after the conservatory door clicked shut, neither Desmond nor Elowen spoke. "I didn't need rescuing," she said finally, though her pulse had not yet slowed. "I know," he said. "I came anyway." A pause, and when he spoke again, something rougher had entered his voice, something he seemed to be fighting to keep leashed. "I don't like the thought of another man's hands on you, Elowen. I am aware that is neither reasonable nor entirely honorable of me, given how little claim I have to feel that way. I find I do not particularly care." "That sounds," she said carefully, "like jealousy, Your Grace." "It is jealousy," he admitted, with a bluntness that startled her more than any flattery could have. "I have not felt it in 6 years. I find I dislike it considerably less than I expected to." He did not touch her. He never overstepped that particular boundary, not once, not in all the weeks that followed. But he walked her back to her chambers himself that afternoon, and the following morning she woke to find, left outside her door with no note attached, a walking cane of polished blackwood, its handle carved into the shape of a small, delicate songbird, silver inlaid along its length in a pattern she traced with her fingers for a long, wondering while before she understood. It was meant to represent musical notes. The melody, she realized with a sharp intake of breath, of the very piece she'd been playing the first night he found her in the music room. She did not ask him if he'd made it or commissioned it. She did not need to. She simply carried it from that day forward, and if anyone at court noticed that the blind companion now walked the halls of Ashveil with a gift only the Duke himself could have arranged, no one was foolish enough to say so within his hearing. It began, after that evening, the way all dangerous things begin, quietly, deniably, in increments small enough that neither of them could point to a single moment and call it the beginning. He came to the music room 3 more times that week. He never announced himself. She learned to recognize his particular silence in a doorway, a stillness different from any servant's hesitant knock. He did not touch her again, not after the corridor, but he sat, sometimes for an hour, listening while she played, offering observations about composers she hadn't realized a duke would know, correcting her once, gently, on a piece she'd misremembered from childhood. "You play it wrong," he said. "2 bars from the end. It should resolve upward, not down." "How would you know that?" "Because she played it too," he said, and did not need to explain who he meant. "I heard her make the same mistake for 2 years before she finally got it right. It should have unsettled her, being compared, even gently, even without malice, to a dead woman. Instead, she found herself oddly moved by the idea that he remembered such a small, specific detail. That grief, in him, had not blurred into vague sentiment, but had calcified into precision, into memory sharp enough to correct a stranger's fingering 6 years later. "Play it for me," she said, the way she played it right, and he did, awkwardly, his hands clearly out of practice, but with a tenderness in the wrong notes that told her more about the dead woman he'd loved than any portrait could have. It was, Elowen thought later, lying awake in the unfamiliar dark of her palace chamber, the most intimate thing a man had ever shared with her, and he had not touched her once. Not everyone in the palace found the Duke's sudden attentiveness to the blind companion charming. Lord Percival Ashford, Cyrilda's elder brother, a man whose ambitions were, in Elowen's private and increasingly confident assessment, considerably larger than his fortune, made his displeasure known within the fortnight. "A curious choice of company for a duke," he said, cornering her in the palace's south gallery on a morning when Cyrilda had been called away to their mother. His voice had the smooth, unhurried quality of a man accustomed to being listened to. Ashveil could have his pick of any woman at court, heiresses, ambassadors' daughters, and instead he spends his evenings in a music room with a pause deliberately unfinished, deliberately cruel, with a blind companion of no particular fortune. Elowen finished for him, refusing to let the sentence hang. "Say it plainly, Lord Ashford. I find plain speech considerably less exhausting than the alternative." A short, surprised silence. Then softer, almost admiring. "You're sharper than the rumors suggest. The rumors suggest very little, as I understand it, beyond the fact that I exist and the Duke has noticed." "He hasn't merely noticed you, Miss Cael." Percival's voice dropped, and something in it made the hair on Elowen's arms rise. Not attraction, not admiration, but calculation, cold and careful. He said a name in a corridor that half this palace has spent 6 years being too afraid to speak aloud. That is not noticing. That is a man unraveling something he swore he'd buried. "And why does that concern you?" "Because," Percival said, and she heard him step closer, close enough that she could smell the sharp cologne he wore, close enough that some old animal instinct in her told her to step back. "A duke who unravels is a duke whose lands, whose alliances, whose loyalties become unstable. And instability, Miss Cael, has a way of ruining people who stand too close to it. Is that a warning, my lord, or a threat? Consider it," he said. "A kindness. You are new to this court. You do not yet understand what happened the last time a woman named Elowen occupied that man's heart. Ask him sometime how carefully the fire that killed her was investigated. Ask him who benefited from her death. And then he was gone, footsteps retreating down the gallery with the same unhurried confidence with which he'd arrived, leaving Elowen alone with her cane and her racing heart and a question that would not leave her now, no matter how she tried to set it down. Who benefited from her death? She did not repeat Percival's words to the Duke. Not yet. She told herself she was being cautious, gathering more of the shape of this palace before she trusted any single voice within it, and that was true, as far as it went. But beneath the caution sat something else, something she did not examine too closely. She did not want to watch his voice change if she asked him the question. She did not want to learn, in the careful architecture of silence and hesitation she'd built for reading truth from men who could not see her studying them, that he had something to hide. Instead, 3 nights later, she asked him something smaller, safer, or so she believed. "Tell me about the fire," she said, as he sat in his now customary chair beside the piano, close enough that she could hear him breathing, far enough that propriety, at least technically, remained intact. His silence went on long enough that she thought she'd finally found the edge of what he would share. "It started in her room," he said finally. "Past midnight. By the time anyone raised the alarm, the East Wing was already lost. I was not in the palace that night. I'd ridden to the border to settle a dispute with a neighboring tenant, a dispute that, in hindsight, feels rather too convenient in its timing." His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the voice of a man reciting facts he had turned over so many times they'd worn smooth, like river stones. "I returned 2 days later to find her buried and the investigation already closed. Faulty candle. Accident. No one thought to ask why a woman who never burned candles past 10 kept one lit at midnight. No one thought to ask why the door to her chambers was found locked from the outside." Elowen's breath caught. "Locked from the outside?" I asked, he said. "Once. Loudly enough that it cost me 2 allies at court who found the question inconvenient. I was told grief had confused my memory of the report. I was told, eventually, quite plainly, to let the dead rest." A pause, and when he spoke again, something had entered his voice that she had not heard before. Not grief this time, but something colder, harder. The voice, she understood suddenly, that had earned him his reputation. "I did not let her rest. I simply learned to stop asking where anyone could hear me." "Do you know who," Elowen asked carefully, "might have wanted her dead?" "I have suspicions," he said. "I have had 6 years to build them, brick by brick, into something I still cannot prove. But I will tell you this, Elowen," and it was the first time he had used her given name since the corridor, and it landed in her chest like a struck bell. "Whoever locked that door did not do it for a reason so simple as an accident, and I do not believe, given how swiftly and thoroughly a blind stranger with her name was welcomed into this palace 3 weeks ago, that coincidence is as innocent a word as this court would like me to believe." Elowen's hands had gone cold on the keys. "You think someone brought me here on purpose. I think," he said, "that I intend to find out, and I think, Elowen Cael, that until I do, you are considerably less safe in this palace than you believe yourself to be." The warning should have frightened her enough to write to her aunt, to request passage home, to remove herself from a court that suddenly felt less like an honor and more like a trap sprung slowly around her. Instead, and she would spend long nights afterward trying to untangle why, it drew her closer to him. 2 nights after Percival's warning in the South Gallery, Desmond came to her chambers himself, a scandal in the making, had anyone seen him, though he came only as far as the sitting room and left the door open the entire time, a small, deliberate courtesy she noted, and was quietly grateful for. "I want to show you something," he said. "Though I understand you cannot see it, I find, strangely, that I would still like you to hold it." He pressed something small and cool into her palm. A locket, she realized, running her thumb over its edges, the metal warped slightly along one side, as though it had once been very close to great heat. "It survived the fire," he said. "It was the only thing that did, from her room. I've kept it in a drawer for 4 years because I could not bear to open it and could not bear to throw it away." A pause. "There's a portrait inside, scorched, but you can still make out the shape of her face if you look closely enough. I used to think it was cruel, that the one thing the fire spared was the one thing that would keep reminding me of what it took. Why show me now? Because a man in the palace kitchens told my steward, this morning, that a delivery of lamp oil arrived at the servants' entrance 3 days before the ball preparations began. Oil ordered by no household account anyone can identify." His voice had gone hard, precise, dangerous in a way she had not yet heard from him. "And because Lord Ashford's family holdings border the eastern trade routes my betrothed's father controlled before his death, routes that passed, upon her death, directly into my hands instead of reverting to the Ashford family as they would have had our marriage never taken place." Elowen's fingers tightened around the locket. "You think Percival's family had her killed? For land?" "I think," Desmond said, "that a fire which conveniently erased both a woman and a marriage contract, 6 years ago, benefited exactly one family in this entire kingdom. And I think it is remarkably poor timing that lamp oil no one ordered arrived at this palace 3 days before another woman, sharing her name, danced in my arms for the first time in 6 years. His voice dropped, low and urgent. I should have sent you away the moment I understood the danger. I told myself I would, and then I could not make myself do it. And I do not know any longer whether that makes me a protector or a man too selfish to let go of something he has only just found. Perhaps, Elowen said softly, closing her hand around the warped locket, around the small, scorched ghost of the woman who had shared her name, and it seemed, her fate. It makes you a man who has spent 6 years alone with a question no one would help him answer. And perhaps I would rather stand beside you and find that answer than be sent home to safety and spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to the Duke who whispered my name like it mattered. His breath caught, audibly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. You are either the bravest woman I have ever met, he said finally, or the most reckless. I confess I find I no longer care which. Perhaps it was that no one, in 6 years of careful, managed independence, had ever looked at her danger and taken it seriously, rather than treating her blindness as the danger itself. Perhaps it was that his voice, when he spoke of protecting her, held none of the pity she'd grown so tired of hearing in every other voice that addressed her. Perhaps it was simpler than either of those things. Perhaps it was only that when he said her name, something in her chest answered like a struck string, and she had gone 6 years without anyone making her feel like more than a careful arrangement of caution and apology. Whatever the reason, when he offered, the following week, gruffly, as though the words cost him more than he wished to admit, to have her move to chambers nearer his own wing, where the household can be trusted, where I can ensure no one enters who should not, she did not refuse. Sorelda, predictably, had opinions. You do understand, she said, helping Elowen dress for the evening's dinner with more urgency than the task required, that the entire court will assume the obvious. A duke moving a companion nearer his own chambers is not a subtle gesture. Elowen, whatever protective language he wraps it in. Let them assume. Percival will use it, Sorelda warned, and something in her voice, a genuine note of fear, not merely gossip's excitement, made Elowen go still. My brother does not simply gossip, Elowen. He collects. Every scandal, every debt, every whispered rumor. He collects them the way other men collect art, and he spends them when it serves him. If he believes the Duke has grown attached, he will find a way to make that attachment a weapon. Against whom? Sorelda's hands paused at the laces of Elowen's gown. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I would ask you to be careful, and I would ask you... She hesitated, and Elowen heard, for the first time, real affection beneath the usual chatter. To be careful of me too. My brother is not always kind about what he asks of his family. What has he asked of you, Sorelda? A long silence, filled only by the soft rustle of silk. To watch you, Sorelda finally admitted, so quietly Elowen nearly missed it. To report anything the Duke says to you, anything you learn of the old fire. I refused at first. I am refusing still, in every way that matters. I have told him nothing true since the week you arrived, but I wanted you to know, because I think you deserve to know who else in this palace is not entirely what they seem, and because I have grown rather fond of you despite my brother's best efforts. Elowen reached out, found Sorelda's hand, and held it. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me yet, Sorelda said, with a shaky laugh that didn't quite land. I haven't decided yet how brave I intend to be when he asks again. It was, Elowen understood later, the closest thing to a confession Sorelda Ashford would offer for weeks. But it planted a seed of unease that would not leave her, even as the Duke's presence in her days grew warmer, steadier, more essential than she had any right to allow it to become. The garden ball came at the end of her 5th week at Ashveil, a grand affair meant to mark the turning of summer, and Elowen had not intended to attend at all. Ballrooms, with their crush of unseen bodies and unpredictable movement, were among her least favorite of court's performances, until the Duke himself asked her to. I would consider it a personal favor, he said, in the music room, with a formality that did not entirely disguise the nervousness beneath it. If you would allow me one dance. I find I have not danced since... He stopped. Since her, Elowen finished, gently. Since her, he agreed. I find lately that I would like to remember what it feels like to hold someone in my arms without grief standing between us. She should have said no. She understood, with painful clarity, exactly what accepting would signal to a court already primed to speculate. But some reckless, long-buried part of her, the part that had once loved dancing before the fever took the confidence along with the sight, wanted, very badly, to say yes. "One dance," she said, "and you'll have to guide me. I haven't danced in 6 years." "Then we are matched," he said, and she heard, unmistakably, a smile in his voice. "Neither have I." The night of the ball arrived wrapped in the heavy honeyed scent of midsummer roses and the low hum of 100 voices already gathered in the palace gardens by the time Serilda finished arranging the last pin in Elowen's hair. "You look like you're walking to your own execution," Serilda observed, not unkindly, fastening a strand of pearls at Elowen's throat. "I feel rather like I am," Elowen admitted. "Everyone will be watching." "Everyone is already watching," Serilda said. "You might as well give them something worth the trouble." A pause, softer. "For what it's worth, Elowen, whatever my brother says, whatever this court whispers, I have never seen the Duke of Ashveil look at anyone the way he looks at you, not even in the stories they tell about her." Elowen said nothing to that, because she did not trust her voice to hold steady if she tried. Lanterns had been strung through the garden's ancient hedgerows, and though she could not see their light, she could feel the warmth of 100 small flames against her skin as Desmond led her out among them, his hand steady at the small of her back, his voice a low murmur only she could hear, narrating the shape of the world he knew she could not see for herself. "The musicians are gathering near the fountain. There's a trellis of white roses just ahead. Mind the step, there's a step, and half the court is currently pretending not to stare at us and failing rather badly." "You're enjoying this," she accused, softly. "I am," he admitted. "I had forgotten what it felt like to want to be seen with someone rather than simply endured by them." The garden ball unfolded exactly as Serilda had predicted it would, whispers trailing the Duke and his companion like smoke, Percival Ashford watching from the edge of the terrace, with an expression Elowen could not see but could feel, cold and assessing, fixed on them both. But for the length of one dance, none of it mattered. His hand was warm at her waist. His other hand held hers with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the reputation that preceded him, guiding her through steps she'd feared her body had forgotten, murmuring quiet directions only she could hear. "Turn now, careful, there's a step, I have you, until the whole vast ballroom narrowed to the small, safe circle of his arms and the sound of his voice. For the first time in 6 years, she thought, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat so close to her ear, this man is not counting his losses. He is simply here. "Elowen," he said, low, near her ear, as the music slowed toward its close. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I am not confusing you for a ghost when I say it." "Tell me," she whispered. "I think I am beginning to love you," he said, "not because of the name we share by cruel coincidence, but despite it, because of your voice and your stubbornness, and the way you argue with me about piano fingering as though I have not spent 6 years being obeyed by everyone who fears me." A pause, and his hand tightened, just slightly, at her waist. "It terrifies me more than any enemy I have ever faced. I think," Elowen said, her voice unsteady, "that I have spent 6 years being handled so carefully by everyone around me that I forgot what it felt like to be wanted rather than managed. You do not manage me, Desmond. You argue with me. I did not know how much I had missed that until you gave it back to me." He went very still, and for one suspended perfect moment, she felt him lean closer, felt his breath warm against her temple, felt the whole trembling weight of everything neither of them had yet dared to say hang unbearably between them, before a woman's scream tore across the garden, followed by the shattering crash of glass, and the music stumbled into silence. "Fire!" someone shouted, from the direction of the east terrace. The East Wing is burning." Desmond went rigid beside her, his hand crushing hers, and in the sudden chaotic surge of the crowd around them, Elowen heard him whisper, in a voice gone hollow with a horror she did not yet understand, "Not again. God help us. Not again." Around them the garden dissolved into panic, silk skirts snatched up in running feet, a man's voice bellowing for water, for guards, for someone to check the household ledgers were pulled from the archive room before the flames reached that far. Elowen gripped Desmond's arm, her carved blackwood cane useless against a crowd that could not see her need for a clear path any more than she could see the danger closing in around them, and felt him turn his body instinctively to shield hers from the crush. "Stay with me," he said, urgent, low, all the softness of moments before burned away by something harder, older, the voice of a man who had lost people to fire before and did not intend to lose another. "Whatever happens, Elowen, do not let go of my arm." And somewhere beneath the panic, beneath the smoke beginning to curl visible even to her limited perception as a deepening of shadow against the summer dark, Elowen heard another sound, quieter, deliberate, almost lost beneath the screaming. A woman's laughter, distant, familiar somehow, in a way she could not place, rising from the direction of the burning wing itself, as though someone stood very close to the flames and found them nothing at all to fear. She felt Desmond's whole body go rigid beside her. "That voice," he breathed, so quietly she almost didn't catch it over the chaos. "That is not possible." "Desmond, I know that laugh," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, Duke Desmond Ashcombe's voice cracked entirely open, stripped of every wall he had spent 6 years building. "I buried that laugh 6 years ago." And then Lord Percival Ashford's voice, close behind her, low enough that only she could hear it beneath the roar of the gathering crowd. "I did warn you, Miss Cael. This palace has a habit of repeating its worst mistakes." Smoke rolled thick and bitter across the garden, and beneath the screaming, beneath the frantic clatter of buckets and boots on gravel, that laugh came again, closer this time, threading through the chaos like a blade slipping between ribs. Desmond's hand had not left Elowen's arm since the first scream. Now it tightened until she felt the tremor running through his fingers, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear for himself. "Stay behind the fountain," he said, low, urgent. "Do not move from this spot. I mean it, Elowen. Whatever you hear, whatever anyone tells you, do not move." "Desmond, wait." But he was already gone, his footsteps tearing across the gravel toward the burning wing. And Elowen stood alone in the smoke-thickened dark with her cane gripped white-knuckled in one hand, and Percival Ashford's parting words still coiled cold around her throat. This palace has a habit of repeating its worst mistakes. She did not stay behind the fountain. She had spent 6 years learning that safety, for a woman who could not see danger coming, was never found by standing still and hoping it passed her by. It was found by moving carefully, deliberately, toward the one thing that might actually protect her. Information, and the man who had, despite every reason not to, made her trust him. She followed the sound of his footsteps as far as the terrace, one hand trailing the stone balustrade, smoke stinging her sightless eyes and searing the back of her throat, until a hand closed around her wrist that was not Desmond's. "There you are," Percival Ashford said, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual silken control. Beneath the smoke, she caught the sharper scent of fear on him, real fear, the kind a man wears when a plan has slipped its leash. "You should not be out here, Miss Cael. Let go of me." "I would," he said, "if I believed you'd simply return to your chambers and forget everything you've heard tonight, but I don't think you're the forgetting sort." His grip tightened, dragging her back from the terrace steps, away from the direction Desmond had run. "Come with me, quietly. I have no wish to hurt you, truly, whatever you believe in me, but I cannot have you anywhere near that wing when the truth comes out." "What truth, Percival?" Her voice was steadier than she felt, cane held tight enough to swing if it came to that. "What did you do?" A long, ragged breath. "Not me," he said, "not entirely. I inherited a debt 6 years old, Miss Cael, the same as you inherited a dead woman's name. My father made an arrangement with Ashveil's steward the night of the first fire, an arrangement that was never meant to require a second one." His hand shook against her wrist. "But she came back. God help us. She came back 3 weeks ago, the same week you arrived, and she has been hiding in the old gatehouse ever since, and tonight she decided she was done hiding." Elowen's blood went cold. "She? You mean Elowen Cael," Percival said. "The Duke's betrothed. She never died in that fire, Miss Cael. She was taken from it, and for 6 years, my family has paid a considerable fortune to make certain she stayed exactly where we put her." Elowen's mind reeled backward, unbidden, to a conversation weeks earlier. The one true, unguarded thing Desmond had told her about that night, spoken low and rough in the music room. "I was not in the palace that night. I'd ridden to the border to settle a dispute with a neighboring tenant. A dispute that, in hindsight, feels rather too convenient in its timing." She understood now, with a sick lurch of clarity, precisely how deliberate that timing had been. A fabricated border dispute, manufactured by the very family now standing accused. crafted for the sole purpose of emptying the palace of the one man who might have questioned a locked door and an inconveniently timed fire before the truth could be buried alongside a woman everyone believed dead. He had ridden 2 days each way for nothing, chasing a crisis invented purely to keep him far from the one night he most needed to be present, and had returned to find his whole future already turned to ash and rumor. She thought of him arriving home to that, not to a grieving household gathered to comfort him, but to a funeral already arranged, an investigation already closed, a portrait he would tear from the gallery wall with his own hands, because he could not bear to keep looking at a face he'd failed to protect. 6 years of silence, she understood now, had not been cold at all. It had been the only shape grief could take in a man who had spent that entire time suspecting, without proof, without allies, without anyone willing to ask the questions alongside him, that he had been deliberately kept from the one night that might have changed everything. Desmond reached the east wing, to find it not fully ablaze but burning in a single, contained wing of servants' storerooms. Someone had set the fire deliberately, and set it, he understood with a lurch of cold fury, to draw every guard and steward in the palace toward the flames, while something else happened elsewhere. He turned, already running back toward the gardens, toward Elowen, toward the terrible certainty settling into his chest that the fire was never the danger tonight. It was a distraction. He found the terrace empty. He found, several feet beyond it, Elowen's silver-inlaid cane lying abandoned in the grass. "Elowen!" His voice tore raw across the garden, scattering fleeing guests, and for one terrible suspended moment, 6 years collapsed into the present. Another summer night, another woman he loved, another fire, another silence where an answer should have been. "She's this way, Your Grace," Dermot's voice breathless at his shoulder. Rennick saw Lord Ashford dragging a woman toward the old gatehouse. "I have men moving already." Desmond did not wait for the rest. He was already running. The gatehouse smelled of dust and tallow candles and, beneath it, something Elowen's memory could not name but her body, recognized instantly and with dread. The particular staleness of a room a person had been kept in far too long, unwilling, unseen. "Sit," Percival said, pushing her toward a chair with more desperation than force. "Please, I only need a few minutes to think. This was never supposed to happen this way." Percival. A new voice from across the room. A woman's voice, low, cultured, and carrying beneath its composure the unmistakable brittle edge of someone who had spent 6 years rehearsing this exact moment. "You've brought her here. She followed me, Elowen. I didn't." Elowen. The name struck the room like a stone through glass, and Elowen, the Elowen who could not see, who had spent 6 years reading truth in voices because faces were denied her, understood, with a clarity that made her stomach drop, that she was now standing in a room with a dead woman whose name she shared. "You're alive," Elowen said, into the smoke-stung dark. "For 6 years," the other woman said, in a manner of speaking, alive the way a bird is alive in a very well-appointed cage, a soft, humorless laugh, the same laugh Elowen had heard in the garden, the laugh that had broken something open in Desmond's voice. "You have my name. Did you know that when you came here? Did he tell you what it did to him, hearing it? He told me you died in a fire." "I was meant to," Elowen Farrow said. "That was rather the point. My father owed the Ashford family a debt he could not pay, secured against trade routes that would pass to Desmond upon our marriage. Percival's father found a simpler solution than bankruptcy. Remove the bride, delay the marriage indefinitely, keep the routes in dispute, rather than lose outright, and quietly control a grieving duke through his own steward for 6 years, rather than lose everything to him in a single contract." Her voice, Elowen realized slowly, was not cold. It was exhausted, worn thin as old thread, the voice of a woman who had spent 6 years being someone else's leverage. "I did not ask to disappear, Miss Cael. I was taken from my own burning rooms and told I would die in truth if I ever tried to return. Then why show yourself now?" A long silence. "Because I heard, 3 weeks ago, that a blind woman with my name had arrived at Ashveil, and that Desmond had said it aloud in a corridor for the first time in 6 years. Something cracked, finally, in that careful, worn voice. And I understood that he had never stopped waiting for me, and that I could not bear, any longer, to let him keep grieving a lie." Footsteps thundered against the gatehouse door before Elowen could answer, and then it burst inward, and Desmond's voice, raw, disbelieving, breaking entirely apart, filled the small stone room. "Elowen, Both women turned toward the sound, and for one unbearable, silent moment, neither of them answered, because neither of them knew any longer which one he meant. Percival moved first, and not toward the door. He snatched the lit lamp from the table beside him, backing toward the gatehouse's old timber stair, his composure entirely gone now, replaced by the wild, cornered calculation of a man who understood exactly how thoroughly his life had just ended. "Stay back," he said, voice shaking, the lamp trembling in his grip, its flame guttering dangerously close to the dry, ancient wood of the stair rail. "All of you, I only need a moment to think. Percival." Desmond's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, a man speaking to a cornered animal rather than an enemy. "Put down the lamp. You don't understand what is happening to me now. What happens to my mother, my sisters, if this comes out in full." "It has already come out," Desmond said. "Burning this gatehouse changes nothing except how many more people you harm on your way down." He took one slow step forward, hands raised, empty. "You have done a great many things I cannot forgive, Percival, but I do not believe you are a man who wants 2 women's deaths on his conscience alongside everything else. Put the lamp down." For a long, terrible moment, no one in the small stone room breathed. Elowen stood frozen beside Elowen Cael, close enough to feel the other woman's hand find hers in the dark and grip it tight. 2 women bound now by more than a shared name, by the same held breath, the same fragile hope that reason might still win out over panic. Then Percival's shoulders sagged, all at once, the fight draining out of him as completely as it had flared. He set the lamp down on the stair with hands that shook badly enough to rattle the glass, and Dermot's guards were on him before he could reconsider, wrestling the lamp safely aside and pinning his arms before he could do more than sag against the timber wall, weeping now, the sound of a man who had run out of every plan he had. "Get them out," Desmond said, his own hands not quite steady as he crossed the room at last, reaching for Elowen first, pulling her against his chest with a fierceness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of exactly how close he believed he had come to losing her, and then, more gently, extending a hand toward the woman who had once worn her name before her. "Say something," the first Elowen finally whispered, into the settling quiet. "Desmond, please." He did not move for a long moment. Elowen Cael, standing very still in the smoke-hazed dark, her heart splitting along a fault line she had not known was there until this exact instant, heard him cross the room, slow, unsteady, a man walking toward a ghost he had buried with his own hands. "You're alive," he said, and his voice broke entirely on the second word. "I'm sorry," Elowen Cael said. "I'm so sorry, Desmond. I wanted to come back 100 times. I was told. I know what you were told." His voice had gone hard again, fast, the fury she had heard once before, the night he spoke of locked doors and lamp oil. He turned toward Percival. 6 years. 6 years you let me bury a woman who was alive. 6 years you let me believe a locked door and a fire were an accident I imagined out of grief." "My father made that choice," Percival said, backing toward the wall. "I was 17 when it happened, Your Grace. I swear to you I only learned the truth 2 years ago, when he died and left the arrangement in my hands, along with everything else, and you kept her hidden anyway. Because the moment she reappeared, the trade contracts reverted, my family lost everything we'd built on that delay, and Percival's composure finally shattered entirely. "I panicked tonight. I set the storeroom fire to draw the guards while I moved her somewhere farther, somewhere safer, and then Miss Cael followed me, and I didn't know what else to do. The gatehouse door burst open a second time, guards pouring in behind Dermot, and within minutes Percival Ashford stood restrained and silent, his 6 years of careful ambition collapsing around him in the space of a single ruined night. But Elowen Cael barely heard any of it. She stood very still in the corner of the room, her cane still abandoned somewhere in the garden grass, listening to the sound of Desmond's ragged breathing as he faced the woman he had loved and lost, and, impossibly, found again. And she understood, with a grief so sudden and complete it stole the air from her chest, that whatever had grown between them these past 5 weeks might have just ended in this smoke-filled room, buried beneath 6 years of a love that had never, in truth, finished. No one noticed when she slipped from the gatehouse. Guards moved past her in the dark, shouting orders, dragging Percival toward the palace proper, and Desmond's attention remained entirely, understandably, fixed on the woman whose name she had carried into his life like a borrowed coat, that no longer fit. She spent the rest of that night in her chambers with the door locked, her hands pressed flat against her knees, listening to the distant sounds of a palace slowly settling from chaos back into its usual watchful silence. She did not cry, not at first. She simply sat, turning over every gentle word he had ever said to her. "I think I am beginning to love you," and wondering, with the particular cruelty of a mind left too long alone with its fears, whether every one of those words had secretly belonged to someone else all along. Serilda found her there the next morning, having talked her way past the guard Desmond had, in his distraction, posted outside Elowen's door for her protection. "You've been crying," Serilda said, settling onto the edge of the bed without invitation, her voice unusually gentle. "I'm perfectly well. You are perfectly terrible at lying to someone who's spent 2 years learning to read every crack in a voice, same as you have." Serilda took her hand. "He hasn't left that woman's side because he's in love with her, Elowen. He hasn't left her side because 6 years of guilt doesn't dissolve in a single night, and because a man like Desmond does not abandon someone to face the truth of her own captivity alone, even when his heart lies elsewhere. That is not a weakness in him. It is the very thing that makes you trust him. You don't know that his heart lies elsewhere." "I know," Serilda said, "that he sent 4 different servants to your chambers last night asking after your welfare, before he'd even finished giving his statement to the guard captain. I know he asked twice whether your cane had been recovered from the garden, as though a length of carved wood mattered more, in that moment, than the return of a woman he mourned for 6 years. Elowen, I have watched this court for 2 years. I have never once seen Desmond Ashcombe behave the way he has behaved around you, not distracted grief, no pity, something considerably more foolish, and considerably more real." Elowen said nothing for a long while, turning Serilda's words over the way she turned over sheet music, searching for the note that didn't quite resolve. "I told my aunt I would write, if things ever became too much here," she said finally. "I have been considering this morning whether it might be time." "Running," Serilda said not unkindly, "is not the same as choosing your own safety, Elowen. Sometimes it is only choosing the fear you already know over the one you don't." She squeezed Elowen's hand. "Give him a day, one day. If I am wrong about him, I will help you pack myself and never speak of it again." Elowen gave him 3. She did not seek him out, and he, occupied from dawn until well past midnight with guard captains and crown investigators, and the delicate, exhausting work of unraveling 6 years of a conspiracy in the space of 72 hours, did not send for her, though Dermot appeared twice at her door with careful, quiet reassurances that his grace had asked, after her welfare, and would call on her the moment his duties allowed. It was on the evening of the 3rd day, as the last stubborn light of summer faded from the garden, and Elowen sat once more at the pianoforte in the music room, her fingers moving through the piece he had once corrected without her quite meaning to play it, that she heard his familiar silence fill the doorway. "You're playing it correctly now," he said, resolve upward at the end. "I've had a great deal of time to think about resolutions this week," she said, not turning from the keys. He crossed the room slowly, and this time he did not sit in his usual chair beside her. He knelt instead, at her side, so that his voice came from somewhere near her hands rather than above them, an odd, deliberate humility she felt more than understood. "I should have come to you sooner," he said. "I told myself I owed Elowen Cael the courtesy of seeing her safely settled before I allowed myself to think of my own heart. I understand now that leaving you alone with your fears for 3 days was its own kind of cruelty, however well I meant it." His hand found hers, resting light and open on the keys, asking rather than taking. "I am sorry, truly. You deserve better than silence from the one person in this palace who promised you would never again be handled carelessly. I thought," she admitted, voice unsteady, "that I had imagined the whole of it, that grief had simply borrowed my face and my name to give you back a piece of what you'd lost, and that once she returned, I would become unnecessary, a kindness you no longer needed to extend. Elowen." Her name in his voice had never once sounded like it belonged to anyone else. She understood that now, hearing it again after 3 days of doubting it. "You were never kind," I extended. "You were the first true thing I felt in 6 years that had nothing to do with grief at all." "What happened to her?" she whispered, still seated at the piano, his hand still warm over hers. "Elowen Cael, what happens now?" "She will be cared for," he said gently. "Given back her name, her freedom, restitution for 6 stolen years. She deserves nothing less, and I will see it done, because I owe her that much for the love we once shared and the horror she survived alone. But she will not have my heart, Elowen, not any longer. That belongs entirely and rather inconveniently to a woman who cannot see me and somehow still sees more of who I am than anyone else in this palace ever has. I am not confusing you for her, he added, fierce now, certain, drawing her hands into his. I have not been, not since the music room, not since you told me you were considerably less tragic and considerably more likely to bump into furniture. I fell in love with your stubbornness, your unwillingness to be handled, the way you hear the truth in a room faster than any man at court with 2 working eyes. I do not want a ghost, Elowen. I have spent 6 years buried with one. I want you. Elowen sat very still, her hand trembling in his. 6 years of careful, guarded independence warring with something far more dangerous. Hope, undiluted and terrifying. The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular disorienting speed of a court reordering itself around a scandal too large to contain. Percival Ashford was stripped of his lands and title within a fortnight. The trade routes his family had manipulated for 6 years reverting fully and permanently to Ashveil. The Crown's own investigators uncovering, layer by layer, the full architecture of the conspiracy his father had built and he had inherited and, in his panic, made infinitely worse. The formal hearing was held in the capital, in a chamber of cold marble and colder judges, and Desmond insisted, against Dermot's urging and the guard captain's open alarm, that Elowen accompany him. You do not need to sit through this, he told her, the morning of the hearing, his hand steady over hers in the carriage. I was in that gatehouse, she said. I have as much right to hear the truth spoken plainly as anyone in that chamber, perhaps more. It was there, in the crowded hearing room, that the last and ugliest piece of the conspiracy surfaced, a final, desperate gambit from a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Percival, given leave to speak in his own defense, instead turned toward where Elowen sat beside Desmond and spoke words meant to wound rather than exonerate. She isn't only a coincidence, Your Grace, he said, his composure long since abandoned. Did you never think to ask why a blind woman with your dead betrothed's exact name was so easily granted passage to this palace? My father's steward arranged the invitation. I only learned it myself the week before the ball, a final insurance, in case the first Elowen's silence ever failed. Bring a second one close enough to keep you distracted, keep you occupied, keep you from asking questions none of us wished answered. His voice cracked, desperate now, reaching for anything that might delay the inevitable. She was meant to be a diversion, Your Grace, nothing more. Ask her how convenient it truly was, that a woman who could not see the difference between kindness and manipulation was placed directly in your path. The chamber went utterly silent. Elowen felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the old familiar heat of being discussed rather than addressed, judged by people who assumed her blindness, made her an easier target for their theories than for their honesty. For one terrible moment, doubt flickered through her, not of herself, but of the invitation that had brought her here, of her aunt's strange hesitation reading that letter aloud 3 weeks before any of this began. Then Desmond's hand tightened around hers, and he rose to his feet, and his voice filled the chamber with the particular, absolute authority of a man who had spent 6 years being feared, and had finally found something worth defending more than his own reputation. I do not care, he said, whether Lord Ashford's father arranged Miss Cael's invitation to manipulate me. I have known manipulation intimately for 6 years, my lords. I recognize its shape, its coldness, its calculation. What grew between myself and Miss Cael in that palace was none of those things. A conspiracy can arrange a meeting. It cannot arrange a woman's stubbornness, her honesty, the particular grace with which she corrected my grief without ever once asking me to abandon it. Whatever Lord Ashford intended when he brought her here, he miscalculated the one variable no conspiracy can control. His voice dropped, quieter now, meant only for the room to overhear rather than for the judges to weigh. He forgot that even a diversion can become, entirely on her own, the truest thing a man has ever found. The judges, in the end, were unmoved by Percival's final gambit, seeing it precisely for what it was, the flailing cruelty of a man attempting to drag someone else down into the wreckage of his own making. He was stripped of every remaining title and holding, his testimony entered fully into the Crown's record, his sentence set at exile rather than execution, on the strength of Desmond's continued insistence that vengeance built nothing worth having. But it was not the judge's verdict that Elowen carried home with her that evening. It was the sound of Desmond's voice, rising in that cold marble chamber, choosing her, publicly, unflinchingly, over every doubt a desperate man had tried to plant. "You didn't have to do that," she told him. In the carriage home, her voice still unsteady. "I did," he said simply. "I have spent 6 years letting other people's silence decide what this palace believed about me. I find I have no intention of letting anyone's lies decide what it believes about you." Elowen Cael, for her part, did not stay at Ashveil. She left within the month for the coast, for a quiet house Desmond arranged and funded without hesitation, carrying with her the restored fortune of her father's estate, and Elowen Cael suspected, a great deal of healing still ahead of her. Before she left, she asked to see, or rather, to speak with, the woman who shared her name. "I'm glad it was you," she told Elowen Cael, in the palace's small chapel, her voice steadier now than it had been in the gatehouse. "I used to imagine, in that gatehouse, all the ways he might finally move forward without me. I never imagined it would be someone who understood him without needing to see him at all. I think that suits him better than sight ever could have. He spent so many years being watched, and judged, and calculated by people who only ever saw the Duke. I think it does something rather remarkable to a man, being loved by someone who only ever hears the truth of him." Elowen Cael did not have words equal to that gift, so she simply reached for the other woman's hand and held it. Two women bound by a name and a fire, and a man neither of them had asked to love, parting now as something closer to sisters than rivals. Her Aunt Bettina arrived at Ashveil a week later, summoned by a letter Elowen had written with her own trembling hand. The first true letter she had sent in months, that did not read like a careful performance of well-being for someone else's benefit. "You look happy," Bettina said, holding both of Elowen's hands the moment she stepped down from the carriage, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself. "Truly happy, Elowen, not merely safe. I confess I did not expect that letter you sent, 3 weeks ago now, requesting I send along your mother's wedding lace. You knew then, before I told you plainly." "I suspected," Bettina admitted, "from the first letter you sent describing a duke who corrected your pianoforte fingering as though it mattered more than anything else in the world. I have known you since you were small, Elowen. You have never once written so many words about a man's voice unless your heart had already decided something your mind hadn't caught up to yet." Elowen laughed, surprised into it, and found Desmond's hand settling warm at the small of her back as he came to greet her aunt himself. "Lady Bettina," he said, with a formality that did not entirely disguise his nervousness. The same nervousness, Elowen realized, that had colored his voice the very first time he asked her to dance. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay. You raised a woman capable of teaching a rather stubborn duke how to feel something again." "See that you remember it," Bettina said, not unkindly, though her grip on his offered hand was firmer than courtesy strictly required. "She has spent 6 years being underestimated by people who mistook her blindness for fragility. I trust you have learned better." "Considerably better," Desmond said, glancing toward Elowen with a warmth that needed no sight to be felt. "She has taught me more about being truly seen than anyone with working eyes ever managed." That evening, walking the garden paths with her aunt on one arm and Desmond's steady presence close on her other side, Elowen understood, fully, finally, that whatever fear had brought her to Ashveil 3 weeks into a season she'd never wanted, it had delivered her, against every reasonable expectation, into a life considerably larger and warmer than the careful, managed independence she'd built for herself in Fenmore. In the days that followed, Desmond made a quiet habit of walking the palace grounds with her each morning before the household woke fully around them, not guiding her, she noticed, not steering her by the elbow the way well-meaning strangers so often did, but simply walking beside her, describing the world in small, unhurried details only he seemed to think worth offering. The particular blue of the sky, when the light was still low and gray at the edges, the exact shape of a hawk circling above the eastern orchard, the way frost silvered the hedgerows on the mornings that had begun, ever so faintly, to carry the first cool edge of autumn. "You don't have to do this," she told him one such morning, her hand resting light on his arm as they walked. "Describe everything to me. I've made a whole life out of not needing it." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. I spent 6 years learning to see nothing at all. Only grief, only the shape of what I'd lost. You have taught me, without meaning to, how to look at the world properly again. I find I would like to give some part of that back to you, even if it's only a borrowed sight, offered secondhand. She had not expected, in a life built so carefully around independence, to find such tenderness in being seen for someone else's eyes, as well as her own, and yet there it was, steady and unhurried, as his footsteps beside hers. Another small proof that whatever they were building together asked nothing of her, except to keep being exactly who she already was. Serelda wept, loudly, unapologetically, the way she did everything. When Desmond asked Elowen to marry him in the same music room where he had once corrected her fingering on a piece he'd learned from a ghost. "I have no dowry," Elowen reminded him, laughing despite the tears gathering in her own sightless eyes as he knelt, absurdly, formally, before her. "No fortune, no sight to admire whatever ring you're about to press into my hand. I have more fortune than any man requires," he said, "and considerably less need of a wife who can admire it than one who can argue with me about pianoforte fingering for the next 40 years. His voice softened, dropping every last wall he had left. "I do not need you to see me, Elowen. I need you to keep hearing me the way you have since the first day you fell into my arms and said my name back, like it was something worth trusting. Marry me. Not because a palace whispered your name into a legend, but because I chose you entirely, deliberately, with my eyes wide open even if yours cannot be." "Yes," she said, before he had even finished the question, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Desmond, 1,000 times yes." They were married in the same gardens where the fire had nearly taken everything, beneath lanterns strung once more through the ancient hedgerows. And if any guest thought it strange that the bride could not see the grandeur of the palace she was marrying into, not one of them was foolish enough to say so within the Duke's hearing. Elowen wore the bird-carved cane at her side, even at her own wedding, polished until the silver notes along its handle caught what light there was, a small, defiant reminder that love, in the end, had never asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Her Aunt Bettina stood near the front, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose, and Serelda, radiant, unrepentantly loud in her joy, served as her only attendant, having appointed herself to the role weeks earlier with a firmness that brooked no argument. The priest's words washed over Elowen in fragments: duty, devotion, the binding of 2 lives before crown and God. But what she remembered afterward, what she would remember for the whole of her life, was the sound of Desmond's voice when it came time for him to speak his own vow, unscripted, abandoning the formal words the priest had prepared in favor of something entirely his own. "I spent 6 years believing love was a door that closed once and never opened again," he said, his voice carrying clear and unguarded across the hushed garden. "I built an entire reputation on that belief, cold, ruthless, a man the court learned to fear rather than approach, because fear was simpler to manage than grief. And then a woman who could not see me at all walked into my arms in a corridor and heard something in my voice that I did not know I was still capable of offering anyone. He found her hands, held them steady on his own. "Elowen Cael, I vow to you what I could not vow to anyone in 6 long years. Not merely my name or my lands or my protection, though you shall have all of those without question. I vow you my attention, my honesty, the particular, ordinary miracle of being truly known by someone who chose to listen for it. I love you not despite everything this palace tried to make of us, but because you refused, from the very first moment, to let it decide who you were." Elowen's own vow came unsteady, thick with tears she made no attempt to hide. "I came to this palace expecting to be managed," she said. "Handled carefully, the way the whole world has handled me since the fever took my sight. With pity dressed up as kindness, with caution mistaken for care. You never once handled me, Desmond. You argued with me, and trusted me, and told me the truth, even when the truth put me in danger, because you believed I deserved to face it with open eyes, rather than be shielded from it like something too fragile to trust. I do not need to see you to know exactly who you are. I have known it since the very first word you ever said to me, my own name, offered like the most fragile and most important thing you had left to give. I give you the same now, gladly, for the whole of my life. Desmond, I choose you." Above them, the palace stood quiet and golden in the late summer light, its old scars slowly healing the way old scars do. Not forgotten, never quite forgotten, but no longer the only story its walls had left to tell. If this story stayed with you tonight, if you found yourself holding your breath through the fire, and softening through the music room and hoping, quietly, stubbornly, that love might still find its way through 6 years of grief and silence. Then perhaps it left you with the same gentle reminder it left behind in these halls. That being truly seen has very little to do with sight, and everything to do with who chooses to stay close enough to listen. If Elowen and Desmond's story moved you, consider subscribing to the Royal Duke Diaries for more nights like this one. And if you have a moment, tell us in the comments which part of their story stayed with you longest. Your thoughts, your theories, your favorite quiet moments, they mean more to this little corner of the internet than you know. Until the next story finds you, rest well, and thank you for staying until the very end.